my porch smiled politely and asked me when I planned to move out of his house. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I stood there, holding the edge of the door, my fingers wrapped around the brass handle that my husband had installed 42 years ago. The afternoon sun warmed the wooden steps beneath his feet, and somewhere down the street, a lawn mower hummed softly. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "What did you say?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the papers in his hands. "I just wanted to introduce myself," he replied carefully. "My name is Thomas Garner. I closed on this property last week." Closed on this property. My house. A faint smile still rested on his face, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes now, as if he was beginning to realize something wasn't right. "I think," he added gently, "there may have been some misunderstanding about your moving schedule." My heart began to beat harder. "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "I live here." He blinked. The silence stretched between us. Behind me, the familiar smell of brewed tea drifted from the kitchen. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, the same quiet rhythm that had marked every day of my life for decades. Thomas lowered his papers slightly. "The real estate agent said the property was vacant," he said. Vacant. The word landed heavily in my chest. I shook my head slowly. "It's never been vacant." He hesitated, studying my face. "I don't want to upset you," he said gently, "but I signed the deed. The ownership was transferred 5 days ago. 5 days ago. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't spoken to any agents. I hadn't agreed to sell my home." My hands trembled slightly against the doorframe. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. Thomas nodded quickly, relieved to agree. "Yes, that's what I was thinking too. These things happen sometimes." He extended one of the papers toward me. "I just thought I'd come by and introduce myself before starting renovations." Renovations. I stared at the document without taking it. My name wasn't there, but another name was. Michael Carter, my son. The world tilted slightly beneath my feet. Michael had been handling small things for me since my husband passed, paying utility bills, renewing insurance, helping with paperwork I didn't fully understand. "I'll take care of it," he had always said. And I had trusted him, because that's what mothers do. We trust the hands we once held. Thomas must have noticed the change in my expression. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I forced myself to nod. Yes, but the word felt hollow. He stepped back politely. "I'll give you some time," he said. "Maybe you can speak with your family and clear things up." Family. The word echoed painfully inside me. He walked down the steps and toward his car, leaving me standing alone in the doorway. The house behind me felt suddenly fragile, as if it no longer belonged entirely to me. I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Because deep down, beneath the confusion and disbelief, I knew there was no mistake. And for the first time in my life, I realized my own son may have sold my home without telling For several minutes after the man left, I didn't move. I stood in the hallway, staring at the front door, listening to the fading sound of his car as it disappeared down the street. The house felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves had heard what he said and were waiting for me to understand it. Vacant, sold, renovations. The words repeated in my mind, refusing to settle. I walked slowly into the living room, my fingers brushing the back of the old armchair where my husband used to sit every evening. The fabric was worn smooth from years of use, the same way memories soften with time. This house had never belonged to strangers. It had belonged to us, to our laughter, to our grief, to every ordinary moment that had quietly shaped a lifetime. I lowered myself into the chair, trying to steady my breathing. Michael's name had been on the paper. Not mine. Michael, my son, the boy who had once run through these halls barefoot, chasing the dog we'd had for nearly 15 years. The boy who had stood in this very room on his graduation day, promising he would always stay close. "I'll never leave you alone," he had said. My hands trembled slightly. He wouldn't do this. He couldn't. There had to be an explanation. I stood and walked into the kitchen, reaching instinctively for my phone. It sat on the counter exactly where I had left it that morning. My fingers hesitated before dialing his number. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then his voice answered, calm and familiar. "Hey, Mom." Relief rushed through me at the sound. "Michael," I said softly. "Someone came to the house today." A pause. "Oh," he replied. He said he bought this place." Silence filled the line, not confusion, not surprise. Silence. My stomach tightened. "He showed me papers," I continued. "Your name was on them." Another pause, longer this time. Then he exhaled slowly. "I was going to tell you," he said. The words struck harder than any denial could have. "You were going to tell me what?" I asked. "That I handled it. Handled it." I gripped the edge of the counter. "Handled what?" "The sale," he said quietly. "It was necessary. Necessary." The room spun slightly around me. "You sold my house," I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. "I sold the property," he corrected gently. "Property, not home. Not the place where his father had taken his last breath. Not the place where I had spent nearly half my life. Property." "Why?" I asked. His voice remained calm. "You shouldn't be living alone anymore." My chest tightened painfully. "That wasn't your decision to make." "I'm trying to protect you," he said. "Protect." That word again. I had heard it before. Used carefully. Used to justify things I hadn't asked for. "You had no right," I said quietly. Another silence. "Then I have power of attorney," he replied. The words drained the warmth from my body. Power of attorney. I remembered signing something months ago, papers he had brought to the kitchen table. Explaining it was only to help with bills and medical forms. "I trusted you," I whispered. "I know," he said. And somehow that made it worse, because he sounded calm, certain, as if everything had already been decided, as if my life had already been transferred into his hands. After I hung up the phone, the silence in the kitchen felt heavier than it ever had before. I stood there, staring at the blank screen in my hand, trying to remember the exact moment I had given him that power. It had been months ago, maybe longer. Time moves differently when you grow older. Days blend into one another. Quiet routines replacing milestones. Michael had come over one afternoon carrying a folder and his usual patient smile. Just some paperwork, he had said. Nothing urgent. We had sat at this very kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the surface, while he laid the papers in front of me. It just lets me help with bills if anything ever happens, he explained. So you don't have to stress. I remembered hesitating. Not because I doubted him, but because I had never needed help before. You trust me, don't you? He asked gently. I had looked at him then, the same boy I had held when he was born, the same face that still carried pieces of his father. Of course I trusted him. I signed. I hadn't read every line. I hadn't imagined I needed to. Now, standing alone in my kitchen, I understood how easily trust could be turned into permission. I walked slowly through the house, my fingers trailing along familiar surfaces, the dining table, the hallway wall, the framed photographs that marked birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary days that had once felt endless. This place had never been an investment. It had been my life. My eyes stopped on a photograph of Michael and his father standing in the front yard, their arms around each other, smiling in the summer heat. Michael had been 16 then, young, gentle, unchanged by whatever had brought us here. I picked up the frame carefully. When did you decide? I whispered to it. There was no answer, only the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind me. A sudden knock at the door made my heart jump. For a moment, I hoped it might be Michael, that he had come to explain, that he would tell me there had been a mistake. I opened the door. It was the same man from earlier, Thomas. He looked apologetic. I'm sorry to bother you again, he said. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. I nodded politely. I spoke with my son. His expression shifted slightly. And he confirmed it, I said. Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't know anyone was living here, he said. The listing said the home was unoccupied. Unoccupied. The word stung more than I expected, as if I had already disappeared. I understand, I replied quietly. He shifted his weight, holding the folder at his side. The closing was legal, he said carefully. Everything went through properly. Legal. Proper. Words that made injustice sound orderly. I looked past him at the front yard, at the tree my husband had planted the year Michael was born. Its branches stretched wide now, older than the boy it had grown beside. How long do I have? I asked softly. Thomas hesitated. Then he answered. 30 days. 30 days. 30 days before strangers would walk through these rooms. 30 days before this house would no longer belong to me. 30 days before my son's decision became permanent. As he walked back to his car, I stood in the doorway, watching the place that had always been mine. And for the first time since Michael was born, I wondered if he had been planning this longer than I realized. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the house as it settled into darkness. Every sound felt sharper now, the ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the windows, the quiet hum of electricity behind the walls. 30 days. 30 days until strangers would claim this space as theirs. My son had said it was necessary. He had said it calmly, as if selling my home was no different than paying a bill. I turned onto my side, looking at the dresser across the room. The surface was clean, except for a small jewelry box and the framed photograph of my husband, taken the year before he passed. He had loved this house. He had built half of it himself. Every shelf, every repair, every small improvement carried his hands in it. He used to say, "A home remembers the people who care for it." I wondered if it remembered betrayal too. Morning came slowly, bringing pale light through the curtains. I rose early, moving carefully through the hallway. My body followed its usual routine, tea first, then toast, but nothing tasted the same. Everything felt temporary. As I stood at the kitchen sink, my eyes drifted toward the far end of the hallway, toward a door that stayed closed most days. The spare room, Michael's old room. I hadn't gone inside for years. Not because I couldn't, because I didn't need to. Some memories are easier to leave undisturbed. Still, something pulled me toward it now. I walked slowly down the hallway and rested my hand on the doorknob. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I opened it. Dust floated gently through the morning light, illuminating the small space exactly as it had been left. The narrow bed still stood against the wall. A faded baseball poster hung crooked near the window. The wooden desk remained in the corner, its surface worn smooth by time. It smelled faintly of old paper and memory. I stepped inside. Michael had slept here until he left for college, until he began building a life beyond these walls. My fingers brushed the surface of the desk. Drawers rested beneath it, closed tightly. I opened the top one. Old notebooks, a broken watch, a few yellowed letters. Nothing important. The second drawer held small objects, a keychain, loose coins, a photograph of him and his father standing beside the maple tree in the yard. My chest tightened. The third drawer resisted slightly when I pulled it. Inside, beneath a stack of old envelopes, sat something unfamiliar. A thin folder, newer than everything else. Cleaner. My heart began to beat faster. Michael hadn't lived here in over 20 years, yet this folder didn't belong to the past. It belonged to now. My hands trembled as I lifted it carefully, because in that moment, I realized my son had been using this room long after I stopped opening its door. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. The folder was plain light gray, smooth at the edges, newer than anything else in the drawer. It didn't belong among old report cards and forgotten photographs. It didn't belong to the boy who once lived here. It belonged to the man he had become. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were papers. Clean, ordered, intentional. The first page bore the logo of a real estate agency I didn't recognize. My eyes moved slowly across the text, each word settling heavily inside my chest. Property listing agreement. The address printed beneath it was unmistakable. My address. My home. The date at the top stopped my breath entirely. 6 months ago. 6 months. Michael hadn't sold the house suddenly. He had been preparing for half a year. My hands tightened around the paper. 6 months of visits. 6 months of quiet conversations. 6 months of smiling at me across the kitchen table while planning my removal from the life I knew. I turned to the next page. Inspection reports. Photographs of the house, my living room, my kitchen, my front porch. Taken without my knowledge. Taken while I was living here. A handwritten note was clipped to one corner. Owner elderly, son managing sale. Owner elderly, not mother, not Margaret, just elderly. A description, a condition, something to be handled. My throat tightened painfully. The next page showed email printouts between Michael and someone named David Reynolds, property agent. One line had been circled in pen. Client currently residing in assisted transition phase. Home considered vacant for listing purposes. Vacant. The word again. He hadn't just sold the house. He had erased me from it. My hands began to shake. I flipped through the remaining pages quickly now, my breath shallow. Closing date. Transfer documents. Signatures. Michael's signature. Again and again. And then, at the very back, a handwritten note in Michael's careful script. She won't understand. It's for the best. The words blurred through sudden tears. For the best. For who? I lowered myself slowly onto the edge of the old bed, the folder resting heavily in my lap. The quiet room felt smaller now, filled with truths I had never been meant to see. He hadn't acted out of urgency. He had acted out of certainty. He had believed I would never find this because he believed I no longer belonged to this part of my own life. I closed the folder gently, my fingers steadying. Grief still lived inside my chest, but something else had begun to rise beside it. Awareness, because Michael had made one mistake. He had assumed I would leave quietly. He had assumed I would accept what he had decided for me. He had assumed I had nowhere else to turn. But as I sat there, holding the proof in my hands, I realized there was one person he had forgotten completely. I carried the folder back to the kitchen, holding it carefully against my chest, as if it might disappear if I loosened my grip. The morning sunlight had grown brighter now, spilling across the floor in warm, familiar patterns. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. I placed the folder gently on the table, and sat down beside it, staring at Michael's handwriting. She won't understand. He had believed that. He had believed I would simply accept whatever he decided. He had believed I had no voice left. My eyes drifted toward the phone resting on the counter. For a moment, I hesitated because the person I was thinking about I hadn't called in a long time. Not because I didn't care, but because life had grown quiet, smaller. After my husband passed, most of our old friends moved away or passed on themselves. Conversations became fewer. Visits became rarer, except for one. My husband's younger brother, Robert. He lived 2 towns away now, in a small white house near the river. He and my husband had built half of this place together when they were young, hauling lumber in the summer heat, laughing at mistakes, arguing over measurements. Robert knew this house. He knew what it meant. He also knew Michael better than anyone except me. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed his number. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then his familiar voice answered, older but steady. Margaret. Tears filled my eyes at the sound of my name, spoken with such simple recognition. Robert, I said softly. He paused. I was just thinking about you yesterday, he said. Is everything all right? The question caught in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't answer. Then I looked at the folder again. No, I whispered. Silence filled the line. What happened? He asked gently. I took a slow breath. Michael sold the house. Robert didn't speak, not immediately, not in disbelief, but in understanding. Without telling me, I added. His breath exhaled slowly through the phone. I was afraid of that, he said quietly. The words stunned me. You knew. I didn't know for certain, he replied. But he asked me questions a few months ago. About the deed, about your husband's will. My heart tightened painfully. Michael had asked others. He had planned carefully. He said he wanted to help you, Robert continued. Said it would be easier. Easier. That word again. I closed my eyes. He listed the house while I was still living here, I said. He told them it was vacant. Robert was silent for a long moment. Then his voice grew firmer. Margaret, he said, did you sign anything recently? I thought back to the kitchen table, the papers, his calm explanation. I signed something he brought, I admitted. He said it was to help with bills. Robert's voice lowered. That may have been power of attorney. My chest tightened. I didn't know. I believe you, he said. His words steadied me. For the first time since this began, someone believed me without hesitation. You need to come see me, Robert continued. Bring whatever papers you have. I looked down at the folder in front of me. I will. Because Michael believed he had already finished what he started. He believed the house was no longer mine. He believed I had nowhere left to stand. What he didn't know was that this house had been built on promises older than his plans. Robert was waiting for me when I arrived. He stood on his front porch, leaning slightly on the wooden railing, his gray hair catching the afternoon sunlight. For a moment, He looked exactly like his brother had years ago. Same quiet strength, same steady presence. "Margaret," he said gently as I stepped out of the car. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear my name spoken like that until that moment. He helped me inside, guiding me to the kitchen table. His home smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood, simple and familiar. I placed the folder in front of him. "These are everything I found," I said. He opened it slowly, reading each page without speaking. His expression grew heavier with each document, his jaw tightening slightly as he reached the handwritten note. After several minutes, he exhaled. "He planned this carefully," he said. The words hurt, even though I already knew they were true. "He said he had power of attorney," I replied quietly. Robert nodded. "That allows him to act on your behalf," he explained. "But it doesn't always give him the right to sell property without specific authority." A small spark of hope flickered inside me. "Are you sure?" He hesitated. "It depends on what your husband wrote in his will." My heart tightened. "I haven't looked at it in years." Robert stood and walked toward a small cabinet in the corner. He returned holding a worn brown envelope, one I recognized immediately. "I kept a copy," he said softly. My husband had trusted his brother with everything. Robert placed it carefully in front of me. I hesitated before opening it, because this was more than paper. This was his voice, his intention, his protection. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the pages. The words blurred for a moment before settling into focus. I read slowly, carefully. Then I saw it. A clause near the bottom. "The property shall remain under Margaret Carter's sole ownership and residence rights for the duration of her lifetime. No transfer, sale, or alteration may occur without her direct, conscious consent." My breath caught. I read it again and again. Lifetime ownership. No sale without my consent. I hadn't consented, not knowingly, not willingly. Tears filled my eyes not from grief, but from relief. My husband had thought ahead. He had protected me. Robert rested his hand gently on mine. "He can't remove you," he said firmly, "not legally." The weight that had settled on my chest for days began to lift, slowly, carefully. Michael believed he had already taken everything. He believed the papers he carried made him powerful. But he had forgotten something. This house had never been his to give away. I folded the will carefully, holding it close. Because for the first time since that stranger knocked on my door, I knew my son had made a mistake he could never undo. 2 days after I returned home, the knock came again. It was early afternoon. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reading through the copy of my husband's will for what must have been the 10th time, letting each word settle into me like reassurance. Lifetime ownership. No sale without her consent. The house still belonged to me, legally, completely. Still, the sound of knuckles against the front door made my heart jump. For a moment, I considered not answering, but I knew hiding would only delay what needed to happen. I stood slowly and walked to the door. Thomas stood on the porch again. This time, he wasn't smiling. He looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly as he held a clipboard in his hands. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I wanted to speak with you." I opened the door wider. "Yes," he hesitated. "The contractor is scheduled to begin work next week." The words hit me like cold water. Renovations. They were already moving forward. "I won't be leaving," I said quietly. He blinked. "I'm sorry. I spoke with an attorney," I continued calmly. "The sale was not authorized properly." Thomas's expression shifted from discomfort to confusion. "The closing was finalized," he said. "All documents were verified." "Not by me," I replied. Silence hung between us. He looked down at his clipboard, then back at me. "I don't want to cause you distress," he said carefully, "but I paid for the property." His voice wasn't cruel. It was tired, uncertain, because he hadn't been the one who betrayed me. He had simply believed what he had been told. "I understand," I said gently. "You didn't know." He studied my face. "You're still living here?" "Yes," he hesitated. "The agent said the home was vacant." Vacant. That word again. "I was never vacant," I said softly. He looked away briefly, as if struggling with something. "I'll need to contact the agency," he said finally. "That would be wise." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry this is happening," he added. "So am I." He turned and walked back down the steps, his shoulders heavy. I watched him leave, the same way I had before. But this time, I wasn't afraid, because I knew something Michael didn't. He had already accepted payment. He had already signed contracts. He had already promised something he didn't have the legal right to give. And sooner or later, he would have to answer for it. Michael didn't call first. He didn't warn me. He simply appeared. I saw his car pull into the driveway just before sunset. The same silver sedan he had driven for years. For a moment, I remained seated in the living room, watching through the window, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I had wondered when this moment would come. He stepped out quickly, his movements tense, purposeful. He didn't pause to look at the house the way he usually did. He didn't smile. He walked straight to the front door and knocked. I stood slowly and opened it. For a second, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved across my face, searching. "You talked to someone," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied quietly. His jaw tightened. "The buyer contacted the agency," he continued. "They said you're refusing to leave." "I'm not leaving," I said. He stepped inside without asking, his presence filling the familiar space with something unfamiliar. "You don't understand how complicated this makes things," he said. His voice wasn't gentle anymore. It was strained, controlled. I closed the door behind him. "I understand perfectly." He turned toward me, frustration breaking through the calm mask he had worn for so long. "I did this for you," he said. "For me. You can't live here alone forever," he replied. "This place is too big, too much responsibility. This place is my home." He exhaled sharply, running his hand through his hair. The paperwork is done. The money has already been transferred. The words hung in the air. Money. So that was it. Not safety. Not protection. Money. You had no right, I said quietly. His expression hardened. I have power of attorney. The words sounded rehearsed, as if he had repeated them many times to convince himself. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and picked up the copy of my husband's will. I read this, I said. He froze. I handed it to him. He scanned the page quickly, his eyes stopping at the clause near the bottom. I watched his face change. The certainty faded first, then the confidence, then something deeper, fear. He looked up at me. You never showed me this. You never asked. Silence stretched between us. You can't undo the sale, he said finally, though his voice had lost its strength. No, I replied gently, but neither can you force me out. His shoulders dropped slightly. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain. You don't know what you're doing, he whispered. I met his eyes. I know exactly what I'm doing. He stood there for a long moment, the papers trembling faintly in his hands. Because, for the first time since he made his decision, he realized he was no longer in control. Michael didn't argue after that. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the will in his hands, reading the same lines over and over as if they might change. They didn't. The silence between us stretched longer than any argument ever could. Finally, he placed the paper back on the table. I didn't think, he began, then stopped. Didn't think what? That I would notice, that I would fight back, that I would still have the strength to protect myself. He avoided my eyes. The agency said everything was valid, he muttered. Did you tell them I was still living here? I asked. He hesitated. That was answer enough. He had erased me from my own life with a single word. Vacant. He walked slowly toward the living room, his hand brushing the wall where pencil marks still recorded his height from childhood. He paused there. For a moment, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in days. Not anger, not certainty, memory. You could have talked to me, I said quietly. He didn't turn around. I was trying to help, he whispered. I believed he believed that, but help does not hide itself. Help does not act in silence. Help does not take away the only place someone feels safe. This house isn't just wood and walls, I said. It's your father's hands. It's every birthday, every goodbye, every morning I woke up beside the man who built it with me. His shoulders lowered slightly. I know, he said, but knowing now didn't undo what he had done. Weeks passed after that. The buyer withdrew. The agency contacted their lawyers. Michael stopped visiting as often, not out of anger, out of shame. Ethan came instead. He fixed a loose hinge in the hallway. He sat with me on the porch in the evenings. He listened, not because he wanted something, because he cared. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the maple tree his grandfather had planted, I sat alone on the front steps. The air was warm, familiar, peaceful. For the first time in months, the house felt fully mine again. not because of legal papers, not because of signatures, because I had remembered something important. Growing older does not make you invisible. It does not make your voice weaker. It does not give anyone the right to decide your life without you. Love protects, control takes, and sometimes the greatest strength a mother can find is the courage to say no, even to her own child. Thank you for being here and listening. If this story touched you, please tap the like button. It helps more than you know. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from or sharing a small part of your own story.